Hello, everyone, and welcome to our webinar today. I'm Kisa Shreen, author of Corporations, Compassion, Culture, and I am so pleased to be here with our esteemed panelists and to also discuss an issue and a topic that has really been dominating lots of conversation, to be quite honest, over the last year and a half, especially, and one that, quite frankly, should have been discussed a lot sooner, and that is mental health in our workplaces, and mental health collectively. Important issues specifically within the financial sector. We have to ask ourselves the important questions of what's being done to support individuals, what's being done to support organizations and corporations, and what is the core when it comes to ethical finance. What is the core responsibility of companies when it comes to ensuring the mental health of workers and of those in their ecosystem? And today, we're going to have people who can help us answer those questions. My guest panelists include David May, Vice President and Vice Chair of the Chartered Banker Institute, and is partner and executive coach and consultant with Asara Partners. Also, David Nikolic, who is founder and managing director of the learning and development company Abstract. He has extensive experience in leading and working with businesses, ensuring they have the right people, the right behaviors, and the right environment to reach environmental and organizational goals. And Chris Speed, who is chair of design informatics at the University of Edinburgh, where his research focuses on the network society, digital art and technology, as well as the Internet of Things. Such an exciting group, such an exciting topic. Thank you all for joining us. Let's get started. So David May, and I'm going to refer to the Davids here, David M, David N, David May, let's kick off talking about the culture of psychological safety and how vulnerability plays into that. I'm located in the Americas, and many people are familiar with the work of Brene Brown and the work around vulnerability over the last couple of years and what that means. But I suspect it has different meanings in different geographies as well as in different frameworks.
Thanks so much, Kisa. I'm delighted to be able to be participating today. Such an important topic, such an important week on World Mental Health Day week as well. It was a few years ago now that when I was working as the head of the business school for RBS, I was working with a professor called Amy Edmondson from Harvard. And Amy is quite an author on psychological safety. And I've been following her work for the last 10, 15 years. And perhaps it's easier and best to start with her definition. And that psychological safety is where it's an environment where it is safe to take risks, like speaking up about an idea, or asking a question, or sharing a mistake, or asking for help. That can sound quite challenging in certain cultures because these are interpersonal risks that are quite clearly mission critical to learning. And that's what I found as well, learning together to create a better organization. And it was that work about creating a better organization learning, because bearing in mind your experience as well, Amy's work was about preventable failure. Many years ago, I worked with a chap, Dave Leesner, who's the head of the Astronaut Corps, when Challenger blew up. And we've all heard about the stories of the O-ring and somebody not being heard and understood. Also preventable failure, we can see things like VW Dieselgate. So what psychological safety is creating a safe place to talk up where it's encouraged. It's another interesting thing. Some of us would have worked in places and know places that high accountability without psychological safety is a horrible place to be. Because being on the hook to deliver something when you can't ask for help, when you can't be vulnerable, when you can't feel you can speak up and honestly talk about what's really going on, is not only a stressful place, it's a dangerous place. And I do see a real strong interconnection with Brené Brown's work on vulnerability. She phrases that vulnerability isn't about winning or losing. It's having the courage to show up and be seen when you don't have control over the outcome. And she talks about courage. And from my Latin days, courage, the original word, comes from cor, which means heart. And courage originally meant to speak one's mind by telling all of one's heart. So it's about embracing our imperfections. Another one of Brené Brown's, because we're human and beautifully imperfect, and that's where our creativity comes from. And the last bit about embracing our vulnerabilities is compassion. And I think this is an important one for leaders, because it's only when we know our darkness well, our own personal darkness, our own vulnerabilities, can we be present with the darkness of others. And compassion becomes real when we recognize our shared humanity. So for me, psychological safety and vulnerability go hand in hand, because we're not perfect, and it's our imperfections that help us be creative. But if you're in an environment where you can't be the best part of yourselves, where you can't admit you don't know, where you can't ask for help, that's a dangerous place. And in a knowledge society, particularly like ours in financial services, we have to have an open space where we can learn and be creative together.
And you know what? That's a perfect segue, David, from moving from that place of psychological safety to creativity and how it allows for that, and really how we are thinking and how we're able to think and strategize when we are in that sort of safe place. And I want to ask that of David Nikolic. When it comes, David, into strategic thinking and our way of thinking, do you think that we have seen improvements, particularly over the last year and a half, to be able to create and be able to innovate in a very high way? Or do you think there have been numerous challenges that have prevented that, as opposed to really cultivated that sort of strategic thinking, David?
Yeah, thanks, Kisa, and hi, everybody. I'd like to say, yeah, we've got much better, but the reality is I don't think we have. I think, when we went into the pandemic, it was almost a novelty factor. We moved, to working from home. And as a result of that, I think we've got new learned behaviors and new ways of thinking, some better, some not so good. We've perhaps had more of an inward focus, I would say, and that means we've been working on our personal workloads. So I know a lot of us have been very productive. Personally, I've been like a machine in lockdown, getting stuff done. But that has a consequence, that has a mental health consequence as well. And our worlds have shrunk. And as a result, we've been super productive, we've got stuff done, but I think we've been reactive to the situation, and therefore we've become more tactical and less strategic, if that makes sense.
Definitely. And I want to get to kind of the two different ways of thinking. I know you and I are both big fans of, thinking fast, thinking slow. And I want to know, what is your thought about how we can perhaps course correct for those of us who have tended to be more reactive as opposed to more proactive and creative in our thinking?
Yeah. So for those of you who are familiar with Daniel Kahneman's work, Thinking Fast, Thinking Slow, he talks a lot about system one, system two, and how we think. And, in a very short time, I'll try and explain it in seconds, but system one is really, Kahneman talks about system one being nothing more than intuition. But then he takes it further. He says intuition is nothing more than just familiarity. So when we refer to our gut feel, it's just what we're familiar with. It's what we know. And system two is where we have to really start thinking hard. It's problems to solve that we're not familiar with. Therefore, it drains the fuel tanks. And therefore, we turn to system one because it's easier. So in essence, I think what happened, Kisa, was, system two helped us adapt. So we had to think hard. We had to think slow and adapt when we went into the pandemic. I think very quickly, system one took back over and it created an operating rhythm. And we've been working on that operating rhythm right now. Some of us doing it well, some of us doing it not so well. And mental health has probably been at the forefront of the issues because, there we are, in our own environment. Our work environment is our life environment. We seldom went out. We didn't get that break of that normal continuity at work, breaks, continuity at home. We didn't get that. So our worlds have shrunk. Our frame of reference has become a lot smaller, and we are now operating with what we would call authority bias, which is taking the onus from us and just moving the problems up the line.
So I appreciate the authority bias piece. I think that's going to resonate with a lot of us, even those like me who had not heard of the term before. And as we get back to that kind of systems thinking, I know, Chris, this is really your focus point in terms of how we can leverage systems to help us be better, to help us deliver stronger. And Chris, I'm wondering if we're thinking about banks and how they can tap into our mental health. Is it a one-way street? Will banks only, use perhaps technologies like AI to look at how they can get clients, how they can upsell? Or is there a way for the other side to have an effect? Can banks somehow support the mental health of their customers, of their employees through AI and through systems? What are your thoughts about that, Chris?
That's great, and thanks for bringing me on, Kisa. It's really interesting, isn't it? There was a language around digital by default. And there was always a tension to what extent we take society and push society into digital by default circumstances. And clearly the pandemic's forced many communities, whether they like it or not, to be digital by default. And that's your point, right? That actually by digital by default, all of us are now in high proportions of our lives, our relationships, our accounts, our transactions, our messages, our comms are being mediated by cloud services in which we lose some of the crumbs, the cake, the coffee, the spills, all of the social material at which, as David's have both kind of intimated, that we could afford as humans a way of beginning to know how we cared for each other and what was at stake. But it's digital by default. So your point might be then, if this data is being mediated, and we can think of this particular call here, to what extent are there any data-driven interventions? Are there any AIs at work beginning to perhaps look at our facial expressions? Which one of us looks the most comfortable, the most relaxed? And to what extent might all of our colleagues be bought into systems at which care is offered internally to employees by just monitoring? Now, like all of us, I suspect we had a sense of our teams being healthy by whether there was cake, whether there was a humour, there was an atmosphere in the studio, in the office. Now, if that's gone, should we be asking our employers to introduce similar technology or technology that would support a similar objective? Or, and as you might be doing in your later question, was should we be extending that ability for a bank to care for its customers by, again, looking out not just for the infrastructure of financial, let's say, well-being, but mental well-being? So it's a bit of a complicated answer, but you can see where I'm going. We're in a digital by default. How do we care? And should we be asking digital systems to intervene?
Now, and I'm wondering, Chris, if we look at the short term versus the long term on that question, when I say the long term, I'm sure years from now, this will be the case. But how do you see us getting there from where we are now to allow this sort of technology into our lives and into our professional settings? I mean, aren't there issues with privacy there and concerns around that? How do you see that transitioning?
Yeah, I think it's a really bumpy process. In software, they call it build, measure, learn. You tend to build a piece of software, throw it out in the world, measure its success, learn, and then try again. And personally, don't we all feel that that's what our organizations have done? They've thrown teams into our workplaces, possibly Zoom. You remember that the late 2020s, we had all those questions around Zoom privacy. We leapt on the platform, and then everyone was saying, whoa, the servers, are they in Europe under GDPR, or are they actually in the US out with GDPR? What are they doing with our data? And they were storing vast amounts of it. I always used to suggest to colleagues to put Domino's Pizza in the chat and see if one turned up later, because who knows where they're selling the data to. I think we build these systems, deploy them, and with good management, we measure their affect. We measure their impact. We measure who turns off their cameras, who doesn't want to speak. I mean, there's some constructive changes, but there's some challenging ones. And I do think we probably have to roll this out iteratively, listening and learning, and make sure we take on all of the values that David introduced at the very start around principles of say, psychological safety.
and I do want to get back to that, introducing what David May stated there. But before I want to get to David Nikolic. David, I want to find out your thoughts on how we are measured. I know a lot of what we do in corporate America and corporate Brit UK and corporate Asia, they're all over. It's all about measurement. It's all about performance. And I'd like to get to that question of how are we measured? And in some way, does the way we measure ourselves, does it contradict how a corporation measures us? And does that have an impact on our mental health?
Yeah, I think it has a massive impact, Kisa, on our mental health. I think if we start with corporations, particularly in the UK, we've always had a strong bond with presentism. And what we mean by that is that, the first person into work and the last person out of work was always the good guys, They were the people that would turn up down the pub afterwards and spend the extra hour schmoozing with the bosses and all that stuff. Not that I'm decrying that, because some of that is actually really quite helpful. But, we've had that healthy and unhealthy bond with presentism. And as a result of that, those people who wanted flexible working, were working from home, were always seen a little bit skeptical. And that had an impact on our mental health. If we were off for the day, we felt like we'd missed out on something, the fear of missing out, etc. And I think, Kisa, that COVID it's given us an opportunity to change how we think. We shouldn't go back to the old world. We've got to go back to better. But I have to say, with corporations trying to maintain control, what we're seeing at the moment is they're almost going back to measuring occupancy. So how many days a week are you in the office? Are you here? If you've got a day off, were you ill? Right. Well, if you were ill and you work from home, you should take a sickness day. And so they're losing a day's production rather than treat somebody, as adults. So I think how we measure has to change, and we have to start measuring things like productivity and efficiency. So if you are productive and efficient, then you're doing a good job, whether you work from home, whether you work in the office. And I think we have to also try and segment what you do at home to what you do in the office. So what are the tasks that you do well at home? What are those things that you can really get stuff done, switch your computer off and get back to your home life? And then when you go into the office, as Chris was referring to earlier, we then have to have that human connection. There's no point putting your noise cancelling earphones on and sitting on your computer. Use the office, use your colleagues, tap somebody on the shoulder, talk to someone at the water cooler, ask about problem solving and get involved in team collaboration. So, we have to measure ourselves at home and at the office to keep our mental state in a good place. They are two different disciplines.
Wow, and this is getting fantastic, because my question is that in order for us to enable this type of environment, the level of seniority, I'm assuming it has to matter. Who has the platform for these mental health discussions? And I know, David, you really have really studied this, David May, and you can really help support a conversation around who has the platform to really support these levels of discussions, to say, hey, yes, let's use the office as a human connectivity point. Let's use and leverage our colleagues when we're in the office, as opposed to, I love the putting in the headphones and just going to work. David May, who has the platform to do this, and how can they support those conversations about mental health?
It's a really important point. And I get slightly worried at the moment, because I think David N is spot on about productivity. And if I may observe one thing, Keith, and then come back to that point, which is in terms of productivity, I think yesterday there was a report in The Economist about a Lancet report that's just come out about there's been like an increase of 28% in depression or anxiety compared to pre-pandemic levels. But interestingly, there is a greater proportion of women who are experiencing anxiety and depression compared to men, even within those statistics. And what I'm beginning to observe was that as days have elongated in the working, because people haven't been commuting, they've been starting meetings earlier, then as we start to go back to work, then the caring responsibilities, which have traditionally fallen to female colleagues, then the dinners are starting in the evening. The ability to spend time caring for younger ones or caring for parents, which again, normally or traditionally have defaulted to female colleagues. It's almost like the days got longer. Aspects of caring have also now been squeezed. The expectation of going back to the office and doing dinners and things like that. So I am anticipating that there will be some really stressful places that are beginning to emerge as people try to juggle. So your question is, who can almost begin to start talking about it? And I guess my personal experience was a few years ago now, when RBS NatWest, we had Mental Health Day and leaders were asked to talk about things. Then I, for one, took a bit of a bravery pill for me back then and said, I was one of the 1 in 4 who had mental health challenges. The tone set by leaders in terms of opening a door for conversation is really important, whether it's mental health or those things which trigger mental health in terms of being able to speak up, being able to contribute, or even as we're facing into now, what does it mean to work in a hybrid sense and where those responsibilities are? So a leader setting the tone, creating the environment for those conversations are really important, because I think we don't know the answers to what's going to happen, but the best way to keep us understanding and learning is talking to each other. What's working, what's not working, and leaders recognizing that they don't know the answers to all these things, but they're being genuinely curious to find out what's happening, what's working, what isn't working, and iterating on that is a vital role for the leader to undertake.
And how fantastic of you to really, bring this to the forefront and say, let me talk about, what my challenges have been. And that obviously shows great leadership in doing that. I'm wondering, to be quite frank, many times people think of certain situations, certain characteristics as superpowers. So, I will adopt this as my superpower. What other people label as anxiety, what other people label as a disorder, I label as a superpower because it enables me to have empathy, that sort of thing. Love to get your thought about how an individual or an organization can leverage some of these seeming challenges, what we've in the past called challenges, as superpowers, or do you think that should not be the case?
Personally, I think that, bear in mind, certainly in financial services, we're serving people, we're serving human beings. Then if and how we identify with them in all their guises, that it's, the culture that Chris was talking about, having a systems thinking approach. If we're thinking we really need to understand and care for our customers with all their vulnerabilities, frailties, and strengths, but somehow we're treating our employees as if they're just perfect, then how will our employees be able to design, interact with customers with all their differences if we're treating them as the same and not having those vulnerabilities? So then having the courage, the compassion, and the connectivity where we can bring people together, because everyday human beings are overcoming their imperfections, their vulnerabilities by demonstrating courage, by having compassion for themselves or for others, and connecting with each other to overcome those. Those are the 3 superpowers that each and every one of us deploy every day. By talking about it, we can tap into those and amplify them more. If we don't talk about it, we bury those and we can't practice those skills.
That's really interesting, practicing those skills, getting them out in the open and using that as a way to engage with our customers. And David Nikolic, I'm wondering, if we look at just using that example alone, that's really creating a new way of doing business, because I don't know of many businesses who advocate for that or historically have advocated for that. And so, David Nikolic, I would love to get your thought on, do we as financial services professionals, as a society who works and operates in this sort of field, do we have the power to create the way that we do business, or should I say recreate the way that we do business? We hear a lot about the return to normal. Can we in fact rebuild and change what normal looks like? And how do we go about doing that?
Yes, we can. But that's going to come back to David May's comment around courage, because David's just mentioned about leaders setting the tone. And I think that's really, really important. So I remember seeing Noel Quinn on LinkedIn a couple of weeks ago, and Noel's the CEO of HSBC, as most of you know. And Noel said they asked him about coming back to work. Is he going to impose sort of a regime of where you work, when you work, etc.? And he said, for me, it's really simple. He said, I've for the last 18 months, I've trusted my staff to come to work and do the job wherever they are. And bearing in mind, he has over 200,000 staff across the world. He said, so why should that be any different? He said, I'm gonna trust them and trust them to do it. But you know, the leader setting the tone is one thing. That's absolutely fine. But then what you've got is all these levels of interaction underneath Noel, as there would be for any corporation. And what you're going to get, and it's almost impossible not to have this, is you're going to get subcultures. This is how we do it around here. That's okay for you, but we do it like this. And you get personal leadership preferences where they say, no, I want to keep control. And all of those things are going to impact on who works for whom. And what's really interesting, in a recent survey, it said that people looking for new employment, their number one priority is flexibility, is being able to do things their own way. And I think we've gained autonomy in one sense, but we're almost losing it in another. So to answer your question, Kisa, I would say it's about giving people trust and autonomy to do what needs to be done. You've hired them to do a job, so let them get on with it and let them come to you if they're struggling. Or as managers, we now need to actually manage rather than move pieces around on a board and actually input data for someone and then do a one-to-one with them at the end of the quarter and tick the boxes. You know, let's start managing. Let's start getting in touch with our staff. And, you know, I think David spoke about superpowers earlier, mentioned superpowers. And for me, you know, the best superpower any manager has is this. Is everything all right? If you can ask if everything is all right, that's your superpower as a manager. Let's start the conversation. Talk to me. So really important.
So, love that superpowers. It starts with the leadership and flexibility. From there, we, as I mentioned, in financial services industry, many times our change has to be driven by something. It has to be driven by profits, has to be driven by revenues, operational efficiency. What is going to drive an established older organization, such as a bank, to make these changes? And we can open this up, David, to you and to the others. What will lead them to do that? Will that be fear from, you know, fintechs coming and challenging them in certain ways? What's going to lead a bank? And the banks are doing okay. If you look at the sector right now, they're, you know, doing fine. What's going to lead them to want to create this kind of change?
So for me, if I can lead that one off, I would say this is about customer connectivity. So how well does the customer connect emotionally to that place? You know, we all like brands. You know, one of the psychology of sales is that the customer has to have an emotional connection to that person or that place. When that stops, that's when people will then start, you know, going somewhere else. And I think for me, you know, the banks have woken up to trying to recreate trust with their clients and trying to attract new clients. You can see already that new clients are being attracted to different brands such as Revolut and Monzo and companies like that. So, you know, Chris will probably know more about this, much more, I'm sure, than I do. So I'm going to hand that over to him.
Well, I mean, the phrase we simply use is a license to operate. Does an organization, in terms of its brand, and brand extends to its user experience, if brands are now user experiences, what are the license to operate? So I might ask my University of Edinburgh, do you have a license to operate socially? Do you have a license to operate environmentally? Do you have a license to operate economically? Well, of course, they're going to use that bottom line. And Scotland leads on triple bottom lines, but we might be adding a fourth bottom line, which is the psychological. And I think it's interesting when we think about ourselves inside and out, we can tend to think of our employees and our customers. And I think we'll find that barrier will collapse a bit, because we'll be asking, as an employer, do I have the license to operate with all of my team? Do they trust me, or are they just taking the money home? I think so many things are blurred now between whether the jobs fit the home lives. So I'd encourage this license to operate. Do we all on the call, and those who are zooming in as it were, believe that there are various licenses to operate? And what might we add to that triple bottom line of previously economic, onto social, and then of course environmental? But mental, physical, does my job keep me healthy in so many ways? And then does the user experience, the inside and outside, is it commensurate with those values?
If I could build a little bit on what Chris was saying, there was the license to operate, the ecosystem almost of in society in which organizations exist. So if you were coming from a risk angle, then the work I was mentioning about Amy Edmondson, a number of financial regulators across the world are now having discussions around psychological safety. So are the organizations safe? So is the culture such that you can speak up, you can tell if things are going wrong, and how's the organization have processes, protocols, procedures, and a culture to support that? Another organization linked to the Chartered Banker Institute at one stage was the Banking Standards Board, and they had a culture index as well. So those are quite important measures. But just as we're talking about customers being consumers of ethical products, so are employees consumers of ethical employers. And there was some research done by Gallup which said that increasingly people who look like me will no longer be in the workforce, but simply because of biology. The millennials that are coming through have a different mindset in terms of the values and purpose and attributes they're requesting from an employer. So sometimes when I come across perhaps leaders and managers thinking, yes, but they'll realize this is the way it's done. It's like saying, yes, if you wanted to buy a portable phone that you had a satchel around your neck and you carried it around like in the 1980s, they will become dinosaurs. And that's what will happen to leaders and managers that don't embrace the things that we're talking about, because the biggest purchasing power of employment opportunities, and let's face it, in a number of areas at the moment, the potential employee has the upper hand. That will also change, just as consumer behavior change, that will change cultures of what managers and leaders are expected how to lead.
Very, very interesting. Those who don't move and evolve in this way will become dinosaurs. And we're seeing that over and over again, David. I'd like to get into some of the fantastic questions from our audience. And thank you so much. Please keep them coming. The first one, do you think we should put trust in banks and organizations to use our data in flagging mental health issues to customers? I know that we talked about that a bit earlier, the privacy issue. Who wants to take a first go at that?
I'm fascinated in this one, and maybe I can be a bit tricky or a bit of a trickster, because I'm a designer as well, actually, in the open banking PSD2 rhetoric, if you like, from a couple of years ago. It was suggested that perhaps even banks and the public don't understand that banks are actually capturing more than just our economic data. That if a bank captures all of my lifestyle data, and if it can use machine learning very quickly to train data sets to spot when Chris has anxiety, and actually you could imagine, Kisa, that I could do this with my bank. So rather than seeing it as something which is surveillance, that Chris, it looks as though you're buying too many coffees today. Is this a question? And making a judgment on that, it could be beginning to ask me, you're buying a lot of coffees today. Is that because you're being super social, or because you've got a deadline and you're trying to burn through? So involving us in the training of data sets, because as I said, yes, that I think my parents probably interpret the bank to be very simple. I'm in credit or in debit, but we should realize that actually banks have the capacity to look and identify what we're buying, our lifestyles, and to what extent they might be red flagging a health journey which is less constructive to us. But this is being speculative. So whether we put trust in it, I think that's what we and people on the call need to address, because unless we embark on this journey with people, they won't trust us. In other words, the propositions, rather like Zoom, are introduced too fast and you lose trust with people.
And so it sounds like, Chris, what you're saying is that the data is already out there, but we need to ensure that we are engaged, that there is a conversation, a dialogue about how our data is being used. But it's already out there, essentially, a lot of it.
Yeah, I think I told panelists before meeting that I was diagnosed with high blood pressure because my optician spotted, and I went to the opticians to get new trendy glasses, folks. I didn't actually have a problem particularly with my eyes, but I wanted new glasses. But my optician spotted that my blood vessels were contorted slightly, and hey, maybe I should go and see the GP. Now, if somehow the bank had picked up on that, it would have been very strange for the bank to ring me up and say, hey, Chris, we've spotted something and we don't think you're in a very healthy condition. Now, that would have broken a whole bunch of boundaries that suggest that I don't need the bank becoming my next National Health Service. I don't need them to intervene there. So however we do head forward into this, either we choose to, nope, we don't want to get involved, or we begin to go on a journey with the public about beginning to allow a partner we trust, a bank, to begin to start helping us understand how we flag and monitor lifestyle patterns.
I guess, Chris, it could be linked to nudge economics in some way.
Yeah.
In that sense. And Kisa, what I see a number of banks doing now, thinking of conversation we had earlier today about ESG and climate and those, is increasingly banks exploring how they can help us understand as a personal customer, our carbon footprint. So how we are spending our money on what products in what way are increasingly data coming back in terms of this is your carbon footprint, and coming up with suggestions in terms of how one can improve one's carbon footprint. So with Chris, that's not a million miles in terms of how healthy are you and have you tried this and those other areas. So it's like a nudge. It's not the nanny state, but it's nudge economics in terms of have you tried this could help. And that's where it can be really supportive in this area.
Yeah, I think if I can just add to that, Kisa, on top of what David and Chris have just said, is the fact that trust for me is born of two axes. It's born of competence and character. And if you think about, can the bank do what we want it to do as a consumer? Yes, great, that's good. But what's its character like? And David's just referenced the, ESG funds, and Chris has referenced, coming in as the new GP. But what's the character of the bank like? Do they care for me? And I think that caring aspect is going to be the next sort of thing on the agenda. Does the bank care for me? Do they identify what my needs before I need them? Do they look out for me? Or are they there just to solve a problem or refute a problem, if you like? So I think that caring thing's going to be really key. So character for me is really important. For years, we've always worked on competence. Can we do what needs to be done? Yes. I think the character is now becoming much more important.
Great distinction between are you there just to solve a problem, or do you take it one step further and help to identify issues and help to resolve? So that's the caring piece of that. Thanks for that, all of you. That was a great discussion. Next question from the audience. How do you think COVID-19 will affect our approach to mental health in the banking sector long term? Now I'll let you all have a go at that one.
Okay, I'm happy to jump in. David,
go ahead, David.
David M, did you want to take that?
No, David N, you started, so you can finish.
So
David N, to you.
I think COVID-19 has changed how we work in the financial service sector. I'm probably going to be a little bit direct here, and I would say for many years in the financial service sector, we've had strong and ruthless leaders, and that, I mean that with love, because I've worked in the sector myself for 30 years. But we've had like strong and ruthless leaders. We've had the system supporting the system, working on short-term gains, and headhunters have been recruiting people who are like, sort the profits out, understands a P&L sheet at 600 yards. These are the people we want. Doesn't matter if we turn over staff quickly, just get the profits in. And I think that COVID-19 has changed that. For probably the last decade, we've been changing out of strong and ruthless and we've been changing towards strong and considerate. And I think COVID-19 has been the absolute flag bearer of strong and considerate in the financial service sector, and leaders and managers have to adapt to becoming strong and considerate, because strong and ruthless is dead. David.
And I agree 100% with what David said, so I can't add any more, but perhaps I could pivot a little bit to support, because if we don't, well, so we had on the Chartered Banker Institute, Edinburgh area, we had a presentation by a NatWest chief economist talking about how COVID has accelerated the digitalization of services, of consumers and everything else. I also see that it'd be a lost opportunity if we don't consider COVID also the acceleration of post-industrial revolution organizational design. So often the way that work has flowed through organizations, has been distributed across organizations, has still been perhaps anchored in how organizations were set up many generations ago. We have been embracing agile, we've been embracing digital, we've been embracing those aspects. I see how work has been shared, distributed, organized and completed really quite differently, and accelerated that change during COVID. If we go back to how we organized ourselves and did work and productivity in a pre-COVID state, it's a real lost opportunity. And I think those forward-looking organizations which embrace the characteristics that David N just spoke about can really embrace the new way of organizational design and getting work done, so we can be more efficient and effective and still have those characteristics that David argued for.
And I think this next question really takes this to the next level as we talk about those caring organizations, those strong organizations. Do you have any advice or tools for line managers specifically to ensure that they can best support their team's mental health? And Chris, I'd love to get your thoughts on that, if you could kick this off. Advice or tools? Mm-hmm.
Yeah, well, I must admit, the first thing I would do is ask them. I don't think any manager should. I think there's something which is flattened. COVID has allowed us to flatten some of the power bases in which people would control boardrooms or control stand-ups. And I do think there's a really interesting opportunity to simply ask, because I suspect it's pretty emergent. I mean, I could post in the chat the NHS. There's a whole bunch of apps on the NHS now, which are not entirely prescribed, but I know GPs are pointing people to. So if you simply Google NHS mental health apps, you'll find. But I honestly do think it's one of those build, measure, learn moments. And I don't think a manager should take the responsibility of suggesting and leading, but actually conversely building trust, beginning to ask, how are you coping? What are you coping? Because a tool might come in the form of a cake and a coffee. It might come in in the form of an app for some people. But I think the first thing would be, let's just flatten this a little bit, accept that, I mean, I'm not in your sector, I'm in academia, but I know for sure within my team's meetings, I've bumped into people who've got children in the background who are clearly off camera because there's other things going on in their lives. We've been exposed, and our sensibilities, our radars have all been raised, which means we do have a sensibility to more solutions, more ways through this. So one, ask everybody and let's bring those things out. And then I think as a community, build, bring them out, measure which ones are working, and then begin to learn. And then perhaps inform local policies, ways that we begin to share how are people coping.
I agree with that, Chris. I think that's absolutely spot on. And we always work on the adage that what people help build, they will not destroy. So it's everybody's business. So it's not just the manager, it's everybody's business. Get your community working together, get your team working together, get some peer coaching with each other. Is everything all right? You know, and having those brilliant one-to-ones these days is not just about looking at your appraisal or your product dashboard and saying, right, you were green on that, this area needs fixing. This is now more about, how are you? How are you coping? How's it going? I've noticed there's a dip in productivity. Is everything all right? It's almost relating it back. Productivity and efficiency will be your measures to your mental health. I'm pretty sure of that. It's a bold statement, but I think your productivity and efficiency will be a good measure of your mental health.
And Kisa, just to build on what both guys have said,
Mm-hmm.
it's just to build in terms of how can the line manager role model a behaviour about asking for help? Because if individuals aren't, or it's not customary to be able to be asked for help, then how can the line manager be seen to be asking for help? Those questions that both Chris and David have mentioned about, I have a concern here about productivity, there's a risk, or I'm eager for your thoughts, but genuinely asking for help. And there's a little exercise I sometimes run, which is asking people, how do they feel when they have to ask for help, particularly leaders and managers. And sometimes I get phrases like, oh, I feel a bit stupid, a bit judged, a bit incompetent, a bit vulnerable. But then when I ask them, how do you feel when you are asked for help? And words come out like, well, I feel respected and trusted and flattered, and it creates this willingness to help. So how can we as leaders and managers role model that great feeling of honouring, respecting our colleagues by asking for their help? And that's a virtuous circle then.
Love that. And as we move on to the next question, I will add something that I've kind of gleaned from each of what the gentlemen have said. And that's really watching the language that we're using too. So the language, how we present, how we share, asking for help may look like a genuine request, and it can be a genuine request when we check our language, check the way that we present. So I think that's definitely a part of that as well. One of our next questions, how would you suggest looking after our mental health in relation to all the stats and data being released about climate change? It can feel overwhelming and upsetting. So many of us are talking about climate change. Many of us are looking at our feeds more frequently, looking at our news sites more frequently. We're seeing a lot of this. How can we handle it and even maybe build, as David says, a superpower based around the data that we are getting constant flows from?
The way, and I'll use a model which I use for those things which do seem overwhelming at times, Kisa. And daughter just at university, her own studies was on climate, speaks to her dad, and I think, gosh, I've contributed to this. And sometimes when you speak to leaders are often, when they have children, a couple of weeks ago, we had the Chartered Banker Institute, and we were talking about the annual education conference, and we were talking about climate. There was a leader who talked about they're in charge of strategy about climate, but also they had a responsibility as a parent. And I therefore encourage people to think about these things in three ways, three columns. What can I control? What can I influence? And what I can prepare for. And if one's feeling this overwhelming fear of something like climate, then what are the actions you can control and you can do yourself? What are the things you can influence and advocate for, but in some ways as well, what you need to prepare for? And my experience is that if you're able to segment your fears into tangible actions that you can do across those areas, you begin to begin to get a little bit of control again. And that overwhelming sense of catastrophization, you're able to break down a little bit into things that you can take control of.
I'm just going to, yeah, terrific. And maybe it's not too basic, but I would also go for a walk. I would try and reconnect. I live in Edinburgh, so we don't have dark skies here, and we have that sodium glow still. Maybe it's an LED glow that's coming. And at the weekend, I was lucky enough to get out to West Scotland and went for a walk at night, and the most amazing stars. I hadn't seen a dark sky for such a long time. And there's something that I think connects with David's point there, is that I can't control the scale of the universe. But it was astonishing just to get back out with my partner, my daughter, and it was truly a moment of, I have nothing to control with the stars, but it allowed me to put some things in perspective, because there were still more stars than there were Twitter feeds and social media issues that on a day-to-day, if I zoom into this device, it will scare the pants off me, to be quite frank. So I do have to find myself, take the dog out, connect with that other thing at scale to allow me to balance out what I can actually have control of, because at the big scale, environmentally, I don't have that much control, but it helped me to get outside. I hope that's not too much of a basic story, but it was useful for me.
No, I think it's one of those things where we hear about it, but we don't do it enough. So really just understanding what we can do, just getting outside of our own minds sometimes and going out and seeing nature and just allow our minds to wander. I think that's a great thing. And also asking yourself those three questions: what can I control? What can I influence? And what can I prepare for? And once you've done that, letting it be. So thank you so much for that. That was really helpful for me personally as well. Our next question: when it comes to suffering from anxiety in the workplace, the person feels as if it often feel as if they can come across as a burden or an excuse to not do certain tasks. How can I overcome this feeling? So they feel that they are either becoming a burden or feel that their anxiety is an excuse. How can they overcome that feeling?
Maybe if I can just start with that, Kisa.
Sure.
I think in a recent survey, they discovered that people who had went off work with high anxiety or stress, even though they had lots of different symptoms, such as a horrible boss or overworked, etc., it all came down to one root cause, and the root cause was a lack of clarity. Now, I thought that was really, really interesting. So to answer that question, I would say gain clarity. Be clear about why you are there, why you are feeling stressed. What have you been asked to do? What can you do? What's within your gift? What can't you do? Go and speak to someone. What is inhibiting you? So I would say clarity is absolutely key in this case. Nerves are good. We like nerves. Anxiety, not so good. So get clarity. That would be my recommendation.
And Kisa, building on David, clarity is absolutely important, because I've noticed that people working from home, working on Zoom, they haven't had colleagues to bounce ideas, to check understanding, to check clarity. So if they've got a thought, then it's almost like the walls of whatever working space they're in are closing in, and people are amplifying a phrase, amplifying a comment, thinking something was said when perhaps it wasn't intended to be said. And literally the walls are closing in and they're amplifying what's going on. So that clarity is critical. And finding a phrase which I call your vital friends, reaching out to people who actually are your friends or your friends in the workplace, reconnecting with them and asking for help, perhaps checking understanding, saying, I'm noticing this, can you help me? It's a big thing to ask for help, but also identifying friends. And I use a statistic which is there is 70% more, this is from research backed by Wraith in 2002, there's 70% more employee engagement if you're able to identify who your friends are and why they are your friends. And if you're then able to tell them, they become even more valuable to you because you're honoring what their friendship is about. So as David said, clarity, if you can find ways of getting your friends or acquaintances to ask for help in helping you to achieve clarity, you're working off a lot of positive energy in that way.
Not sure if I can add too much more, but certainly it sounds like in general, I'm not in your sector, but trying to move from a transactional relationship with colleagues where measurement is based on outputs, performance, but developing this compassion, listening and supporting. My hunch is most of us have forms of anxiety in the workplace now, hands up, and developing that sensibility for spotting and leaning into friends seems more important than ever.
Well, you know what? That was a fantastic conclusion to what has been a phenomenal panel. We started off talking about the importance of really understanding what safety, psychological safety looks like. And one thing that was a recurring theme here, asking questions, asking for help, how we can help build a better organization to help create learning environments by doing those things. And also accountability without safety can be harmful in itself. So really having that psychological safety is important. Also, we talked a lot about behaviors and behaviors that we've developed since the pandemic began, and really looking at different ways to think. what's familiar is one way, and system thinking, if you're a Daniel Kahneman fan, system thinking number two, which involves harder thinking, is a bit draining. That's another way to do so. In the past, if we look at the way corporates were, presentism was important. There are some healthy aspects and some unhealthy aspects to that, but really treating people as adults over the last year and a half has worked a lot, really focusing on collaboration, and also just some wonderful words and phrases that I will look to keep for myself. What incentive do we have to evolve? Customer connectivity, Chris, the license to operate socially, environmentally, economically, and now psychologically is really important. And David, one of the things that you said, the pandemic really allowed us to flatten control in the boardrooms, and your words here, strong and considerate, is now what we're looking at, as opposed to strong and ruthless. Strong and ruthless is dead. That's a tweetable moment. I really like that. And then the clarity piece, David, gaining clarity about why am I here? What can I do within my gift? What can I not do? Where can I get help in finding those vital friends? Whether you are in the financial services industry, whether you're looking to enter into the financial services industry, or transitioning, those are all key pieces of advice and wisdom that we can take and move forward with. I'd like to thank my panelists, the Davids, for joining us, as well as Chris for joining us today. And let's keep the conversation going on social media, on LinkedIn. Feel free to reach out to us. Feel free to tag us to ask your questions or to tell us what you thought about the panel. Everyone, thank you so much for joining, and have a fantastic day.